for you too. Welcome to today's call. As always, don't make any changes based on today's call before speaking with your primary care provider. All information on this call is current to the best of our ability at the time of the call, but if you're watching this in the future, make sure you check for updated information. Now, last week we discussed the ACEs study, or ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's the largest study ever done following people from childhood into adulthood to measure the effect of adverse childhood experiences such as sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, divorce in the family, having a family member incarcerated, growing up with someone with PTSD, or having a suicide in the family, things of that nature. Those are considered adverse childhood experiences. And the research followed people for 30 years from childhood to adulthood to determine, do adverse childhood experiences increase risk of chronic disease as an adult, or increase risk of autoimmunity as adults, or increased risk of suicide attempts as an adult. And all of the research that we covered last week in the previous video says yes. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, the higher your risk of all of those things. And so if you had the question, well, how do I know how many I've had? That's a questionnaire, a validated research questionnaire that you could find online and fill out. And basically the cutoff is if you've had 3 or more, you're at increased risk for those things. So last week we talked about it related to autoimmune disease risk, and today I want to carry forward and discuss a case that I've actually been working up this week for a new patient, that the complaint that the person has is what's called SIBO, which is short for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so this is a woman who's 62. For 2 years, she's had complaints of gas, bloating, constipation, and those are the main complaints. And so she's gone to her gastroenterologist, and they've treated her with Xifaxin, which is a medication that is an antibiotic to treat the bacteria that are overgrown in her small intestine. And so they ran a test, a SIBO breath test. She was positive for hydrogen-producing bacteria. Those bacteria drive diarrhea typically, but she has constipation. So regardless, they gave her Xifaxin. She took a course and it helped, and she was doing better. But then about a month later, it returned, and she did a second course of Xifaxin, and it didn't help. So now it's been 2 years, and she's still struggling with it, and what conventional medicine has offered her hasn't been able to help her. So she's presenting to my office looking for help and detective work to figure out potential exacerbating factors and causes outside the GI tract. So I want to refer you to another video that I made over a year ago here on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and it's called SIBO and IBS. Are they brain-gut axis disorders? And in this video, I help explain why irritable bowel syndrome, or SIBO, may not be coming from your gut. It's in your gut, but it may be being driven, in the context of this video, via a brain-gut axis issue. And so I think that's what's going on with this woman as well. Why would I say that? Well, because her history includes multiple adverse childhood experiences. So in her questionnaire, her score was a 3. And when we go through her history, she states that from as far back as she can remember as a child, her father would yell at her and raise his voice. And so she was scared. She was always afraid of her father. Well, if you're growing up afraid of your father, that's adverse. That causes stress and can cause anxiety. And from a very young age, she remembers always having anxiety and having what she would call a nervous stomach. And so for me, in my mind, that tips off the thought of, okay, this may be a brain-gut axis dysfunction driving her SIBO, and ACEs are probably at play here in her current issue and her lifelong issues. And again, many people because we're trained to think by society that if I have an issue, we're saying, well, what did you eat yesterday, or what happened recently? We're always focused on the here and now. We don't we don't commonly connect things back to childhood, um, and so we miss a lot of things. So I would caution you, don't have cognitive dissonance and be like, well, her dad yelling at her when her a kid couldn't be contributing to her SIBO now. It absolutely can, and the ACEs study shows us that. And we covered last week too about brain gut brain loop research shows that oftentimes you can have neurocognitive dysfunction and no GI complaints, and they follow those people for 12 years, don't treat them, and 12 years later, um, 2/3 of them have GI complaints. Or you could start with GI complaints and no neurocognitive complaints. They follow them for 12 years, don't treat them, and 12 years later, 1/3 of those people now have neurocognitive complaints like anxiety or depression. So it could start from either end. So her dad yelling at her as a child may have caused her nervous stomach, and then ultimately IBS and SIBO. And so for me, the mechanism, I lay out the mechanism for you in this video, so I'll save you the repetition of that. If you're interested, please go watch the video, because we get into why that could all be happening. But I just wanted to teach today that in looking outside the box, we can find the reason. Now, say it's not her dad yelling at her when she was a little girl. Well, more recently in her history, she's seen a therapist because she lives at home alone all the time except for every other weekend a month. Why? Well, every other weekend a month, her husband comes home from working out of town. So she's alone, she's not with her husband, and then she reports in those files that even when her husband's home, they don't have a good relationship. There's not a lot of affection there. He never even asks how she's doing. So even when he's there, she could be feeling alone. And so that's very stressful, to be in a marriage with someone. There's supposed to be love in that relationship, and there's not. You never see them, and when you do see them, it's like they're not even there. So that stress could again be starting in the brain and affecting gut and promoting SIBO. So these mental emotional drivers could be the explanation of why the SIBO is still there, even though she's taken the antibiotic that commonly helps and even helped her previously. So the difference could be mental emotional stress. And then, of course, we're in June, so she's been dealing with 4 months about of COVID stress, or whatever that means to her life, whether she gets stressed by the news or gets stressed by quarantine or what have you. So there's plenty of mental emotional stress in her case, and I feel like that's going to be a significant linchpin for us to be able to impact that and therefore have success with the SIBO and anything else that's going on physiologically that we uncover through testing. So that's basically it for today's nugget. What questions are out there?
So, I mean, not really a question, but more of a statement too. I was reading some articles online about the increase of the call volume into the suicide hotline and all these different organizations that help people, just based off of being at home with COVID for 3 or 4 months, and
Yeah.
just the aspect of what that's doing mentally on people. So I'm sure there's a lot of different issues with that, and physical issues or other things that people just don't want to go to see a doctor, because they don't want to get COVID, potentially.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure it's all underlying and related to all these different things.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment by you and good synthesis of the information, because we ended last week's call with the ACEs and everything, and I said, so how much is COVID contributing to the next generation of chronic disease right now, right? So for all the children that right now are stressed out by COVID because they're not in school and they're missing their friends and they can't play sports, and like you said, there's doctors' offices reporting increased child molestation. Well, that would be a major adverse childhood experience. Increased spousal abuse. So they're exposed to that. That's another ACE. Increased alcoholism. That's another ACE. So yes, right now it's a very fertile time for ACEs to be occurring, and the effects aren't just going to be felt right now. Yes, suicide attempts are going up right now, but those are typically more in adults. What about 20, 30 years from now? What will the numbers look like from a chronic disease perspective in this generation of kids,
Yeah.
autoimmune perspective, suicide attempt perspective? So yeah, great thought there.
Have you
That's what
heard
we.
if they're doing any research on that or start the research of, picking the people and figuring out long term and how to monitor this over the next 30 years and what it does?
The COVID specifically?
Yeah.
I don't know that that's started yet, but I hope and anticipate that someone will pick that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's all we've heard for 4 months is these are unprecedented times, right? So if
Right.
they're unprecedented, then we should study them, right?
Right.
So hopefully that happens.